Coming in, it's saying starting recording. All right, now it's got it's up.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. This is the HistoryNet podcast, if you can call it one, with Mr. Brass and our guest, Tim O'Neill, the man who runs the award-winning blog historyforatheists.com, where he thoroughly refutes the bad history revisionism from atheist activists. Tim, how are you, sir?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
We've been wanting to actually have this conversation for quite a while, since we're both fans of your site.
Good to hear. Thank you.
Tell us all about yourself, your background, and how you ended up going after the less sensible among your fellow non-believers.
Okay, so I'm an atheist, contrary to some rumours that you may hear from some people who aren't fans of my site. I've been an atheist all my adult life. I was brought up in a Christian family, but it didn't take with me. Was brought up by a father who was a scientist and who was a bit of a skeptic about most things other than his religion. I don't quite know how he managed that, but for me, I realised that religion really didn't make a whole lot of sense by the time I was about sort of 17 years old and was pretty much an atheist very soon after, and have been forever, for the rest of my adult life. And so I became quite interested in I suppose what we can call and what is often called the new atheism, which is the sort of the burst of atheist activism that really sort of began in the early 2000s with people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens bringing out books on why unbelief is a good idea and why religion is a bad idea. So atheism sort of went from being a topic of conversation that tended to kill the conversation at dinner parties and became the conversation at dinner parties, and I thought that was interesting. As someone who had been an atheist for many years, suddenly we were flavour of the month. I then found myself reading a lot of the atheist forums and blogs that popped up online around about that time. And what I noticed was that when atheists on those forums began to discuss history or began to use arguments based on history, they were usually getting the history badly wrong, and a lot of their arguments were based on pseudo-history, and on some very outdated historical ideas, some very sort of 19th century historical ideas. They were also, in many cases, were championing some fringe theories, such as the Jesus myth theory, the idea that there was no historical Jesus at all. And so I found myself in discussion with these people and trying to, I suppose, set the record straight as to what mainstream historical consensus views are on those topics. And some of them were quite happy to learn that they were wrong. Others weren't, and I got quite a bit of pushback and some quite sort of emotional reactions from some people who were very wedded to these ideas and didn't like this guy coming along and with all of these references to books and historians and telling them that they were wrong. So why did I start the blog? Well, effectively it was to save myself time. I found myself having the same conversations over and over again about the same topics, and it got a bit boring, just sort of writing the same stuff over and over again. So I thought, well, if I started I was repeating myself. So I thought if I start a blog, what I can do is I can write it once and then just sort of say, look, here's the link. And I go and listen to this. So it was really, that was the beginning of the blog, and that was about I think 5 years ago. And it's sort of gone from there and become quite popular amongst some people and unpopular with others, particularly the people I debunk.
Well, I mean, you certainly got your friends in guys like Richard Carrier and other, I believe David Fitzgerald and the rest of the Mythicist crew. They seem to know you well.
Yeah, they don't like me very much.
And Neil Godfrey in them, and
Yeah,
Bob's I-in sticker.
yeah. Grandpa Godfrey doesn't like me very much either. Yeah, and you know, you can sort of tell when they don't actually have very good arguments against you, and what they have to do is make personal attacks. So you know, they talk about how I'm actually a Christian apologist, or they say that I'm somehow, you know, kind of stupid. And okay, maybe I am. I don't think so, but really, all I'm doing is curating and popularising some mainstream, very mainstream academic historical ideas. Which are, so, if I'm wrong, then all of those experts are wrong. But I mean, and it could be that Richard Carrier, the unemployed blogger who's never had an academic posting in his entire life, could be the greatest genius on the face of the earth. Or he could just be a wanker. I strongly suspect he's just a wanker.
Like saying Ken Ham's the most brilliant scientist who's ever lived.
It's possible. It's entirely unlikely, but it's extremely possible.
And just so we're clear for the audience and anybody who sees, and something I'm sure you're tired of stressing, you're a staunch atheist with not that much sympathy for the Christian faith or any religion for that matter, right?
Not particularly. I mean, I think the difference between me and the new atheists that I described, and many of the people who we were just talking about, is that I don't actually care if people believe in God and believe that Jesus is God and go to church and so on, as long as they're not hurting anyone. And so long as they're not trying to impose it on me. Now, I do care if they start passing laws or they start influencing politicians overly and start infringing on my rights. But the idea that I have to go around debunking religion, unless I do that, I'm not a real atheist. Well, that's just bullshit. You know, that's just not true. I'm very much an atheist. I just don't really care very much whether other people are.
Right. As an atheist who is able to live and let live, like, what are your feelings on the new atheist movement and anti-theists in general?
Well, it's interesting because I've just been having kind of a discussion in the comment section on my blog. The latest article on my blog is a book review of a book on the new atheists' mangling of history by a historian called Nathan Johnson. And Johnson is a bit like me. He's an atheist, but he doesn't feel as though he feels the need to tell other people how they should live their lives. And there's quite a lively debate going on in the comments section on my review, where a couple of atheists, one in particular, is saying, well, we should interfere with what Christians believe, because what they believe is actually harmful. And you know, a case could possibly be made for it. On the whole, I don't really think that if we were to remove religion completely, that the sum total of human happiness would change one bit. I think the kind of people who are inclined towards fundamentalisms, who are inclined towards trying to control others' behaviour, and who like and the very small number who like inflicting pain on other people, usually find other reasons, other ideologies, or other excuses to do those things. So I think the sum total of assholes in the world would probably not change one bit. They'd just have something else to be horrible about. So I don't believe that removing religion is going to make much difference to anything, and therefore I don't spend a lot of time on it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like, what would be your most frustrating topic you engage in? Like the so-called Dark Ages, Mythicism, the Christian persecution of scientists, the Hitler was a devout Christian crap?
Yeah, all of the above. It probably just depends on what day of the week it is. Last week, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's has a big fan base among the sort of the new atheist community, was tweeting about the observation of a supernova in the year 1054 AD, and it was observed by the Chinese. And he then made a comment about how it wasn't observed in Europe. He said because they were steeped in the Dark Ages. So he was implying pretty strongly that because they were kind of enslaved by the medieval church, that no one was doing any science stuff like observing supernovas. Which is total crap. We don't have any record of anyone in Europe observing that particular supernova, the one in 1054, SN 1054. But we do have records of one being observed just 38 years earlier. So there was another supernova in 1006, and it was observed by monks in the major monastery of St. Gallen and in two other monasteries as well. So I asked via Twitter, the great Neil deGrasse Tyson, were they steeped in the Dark Ages in 1054 but not in 1006? Was it a rapid onset Dark Age that suddenly hit in the middle of the 11th century? Or are you full of crap? He didn't respond. But a lot of people like my comments. Yeah. So the Dark Ages thing is the Dark Ages myth. I mean, it's not as though there wasn't a great disruption in the beginning of the Middle Ages. It wasn't
during the collapse of the Roman Empire.
The collapse of your civilization tends to put a bit of a cramp in things, and that's pretty much what happened. And so there was a great fragmentation politically, and therefore a decline economically. In fact, you could say that the collapse of the Western Roman Empire was caused by the economic decline, not the other way around. There was a decline in population, and as a result, when you don't have an empire that's drawing on the economic resources of the entire Mediterranean basin and beyond, pouring a lot of that money into massive infrastructure projects, you don't have massive infrastructure projects, and you therefore have a loss of technology and knowledge. So people literally forget how to do things like make concrete or how to build aqueducts. A lot of people sort of like pour scorn on that idea and say, well, how do you just forget? It must have been because the evil Catholic Church made them all stupid. And the answer is, well, you do forget. If you don't do this stuff for a generation or two, people forget to do it. That just happens. And it would happen to us. You know, if we had a major, let's say, a nuclear catastrophe, we would pretty quickly forget how to build power stations and computers.
Especially the internet.
And that's just in the West. There's the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. Its very existence dismantles the Dark Ages myth.
Well, exactly, and that's what I always say to people when they say Christianity caused the Dark Ages. I always say, well, why was it so sort of specific to Western Europe, where the Eastern Roman Empire, as you say, was
right. Byzantine Empire was more culturally and technologically advanced than the West.
Absolutely.
And it was the very epitome of a Christian empire.
It was also probably more Christian than the Western Roman Empire had been. That's where Christianity began, in the eastern half of the empire. So yeah, it was actually very much Christian. So the idea that that Christianity caused the Dark Ages is clearly nonsense, but it still gets propagated by people like Sam Harris. Sam Harris just last year gave an interview with Ben Shapiro, and I wrote a commentary on this interview on my blog because it was one of the, sort of like a battle of the intellectual midgets.
You don't like either of them.
No, they're both idiots. Ignorant, historically illiterate. They're probably not stupid, but they are historically illiterate. And they were both sort of flinging ideas at each other, both of which were completely wrong. Shapiro, if anything, was slightly closer to being right than Harris, but Harris was just absolutely talking out his rear end. It was just absolute nonsense. Yet, millions of people listen to this guy, which is slightly frustrating.
Yeah. And Christopher Hitchens and the rest of them, they think that since they're so eloquent, well-spoken on one topic, their impressionable followers think they're geniuses on anything they talk about.
Absolutely. I'm in the process of writing an article on, there's an atheist activist he calls himself a Ron Ra.
Aaron Ra, yeah.
That's the guy. His real name is Aaron Nelson.
Yeah.
An unusual looking chap, and he does lots of videos on creationism, and he's on science. He knows what he's talking about.
Yeah.
On history, he definitely doesn't. And I'm doing a commentary on a 15-minute video, 15 minutes of his video debate, where he's just coming out with absolute nonsense about how the Catholic Church promoted the idea that the Earth was flat, which is completely wrong. How Giordano Bruno was a scientist who was burnt at the stake for his wonderful scientific ideas, which is completely wrong. How Galileo, I mean, it just goes on and on and on.
Mm.
Back to the question, though, if
creation.
there's a myth that probably annoys me the most, it's probably the way in which the Galileo story gets misused. That's probably one of the big ones.
Yeah, he also, I remember he made the argument that Adolf Hitler was a young Earth creationist.
Was he? I mean, Hitler had some pretty stupid ideas. I don't think that was one of them. I'm not sure. I mean, I know the Nazis, I don't know if it was actually Hitler, but the Nazis did have a kind of a weird, some wacky scientific ideas about the origins of the Earth, but I don't think they were young Earth creationists. And it's not as though you have to go searching for stupid ideas that Hitler did believe, so there's no need to start making them up. Right, that's a new one on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is something. I mean, I know that Nazis got into a bit of, what's the word for it, Marconianism.
Yeah.
I know they did get into that. Not Lamarckianism, that's with evolution. Marxianism is with, it's a heresy more that you could say.
Yeah, Marcionism, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah, the whole idea that the Jewish God was evil and that the Old Testament should be rejected and all that stuff. Yeah, it's fairly Marcionite. Yep.
Yeah, so I know they did get into that a bit. I always just found it funny. I remember I actually got to talk to I can't remember his name for the life of me, but
Biblical History Skeptics, Chris Hansen.
Yeah, I remember I got into a little contact with one historian on Hitler and everything, and I remember I just brought up the quote that Aaron Raw had sent me, apparently proving that Hitler was a young Earth creationist. He said, no, that's not what he was saying at all.
Okay.
It was basically like he was going more over how he believed that, like, how perfect the Germans were and how they arose first, and and obviously all the other people that, like the Jews and stuff, they were just sort of the defective actors or something.
Yeah.
That was sort of where he was going from.
Yeah.
I believe
the Nazis did have their own kind of version of Christianity that they called positive Christianity, which was sort of like Christianity with all the nice bits taken out and lots of anti-Semitism added. Exactly how seriously the leading Nazis took that is hard to tell. Hitler himself doesn't seem to have been a great believer, though he did believe in God. So the idea that Hitler was an atheist is something that gets spread around by the other side, by Christians. So everyone wants Hitler to be sort of on the other team for some reason. He was definitely not an atheist, but he certainly wasn't a Christian either.
Oh yeah, Hitler's sort of like that kid with the limp who, like, someone has told them that they have to have him on their team, and it's like no one wants them.
No one wants it. No one wants Hitler on their team. Yeah.
All right, the topic that gets under the skin of the more fanatical atheists, mythicism. What has been your experience dealing with that? And does it ever get tiring having to reason people out of a position they didn't reason themselves into?
Yeah, it does, and sometimes for years there I did sort of persist with it. There was a forum that I was quite active on called Rational Skepticism, which spun off from what used to be the RichardDawkins.net forum, which got closed down a few years ago. And there was a thread on that discussion forum which is still going. So I think it's been going for almost a decade now. It's thousands of pages long. And it's where mythicists and historicists debate each other. And I was an active participant on that thread for a number of years until, my girlfriend at the time sort of said to me, haven't you got better things to do with your time?
That's my girlfriend.
And the answer was, yeah. She said, look, if you haven't convinced these guys by now, you're never going to convince them. The funny thing is that there were a couple of guys on that particular thread who I did convince that Jesus existed. And then they went away from the thread for about a week or two, and then came back, and they were mythicists again. And I'd say to them, "Well, hang on, you admitted that it made sense that the historical Jesus existed." They said, "Well, but I've come across these new arguments." There's two guys. It happened to two of them. I've come across these new arguments. I go, okay, what are these new arguments? They tell me, and I said, I've refuted those like 10 times. So obviously, as you say, then they pretend that they're actually reasoning this stuff through, but actually it's an emotional reaction. And one of those guys said to me at one point, if I admit that a historical Jesus existed, then that means the Christians are right about something. And what if they're right about everything else? So he's kind of making this sort of slippery slope argument about how if I concede that point, then maybe I'll end up becoming a Christian again. So it wasn't as though he was actually making a whole lot of sense. It was an emotional reaction. So with mythicism, I suppose I first came across mythicism many years ago when I first started studying the origins of Christianity, because it's not a new idea. It's been around since the 18th century, and it was considered reasonably seriously by scholars of the New Testament back in the late 19th and early 20th century, and was rejected. But it was certainly taken reasonably seriously. So when mythicists sort of make out that they're coming up with some radical new idea, that barely any of their arguments are new. Most of them are really just rehashes of the stuff that came out of the 19th century. So when I first started studying the origins of Christianity, when I was at university at the age of about 18 or 19, I certainly looked at mythicism and considered it myself. It's a perfectly valid idea. It's not like it's completely absurd. There are examples of people who have come to be regarded as historical, who were clearly not. There's not many of them, but there are some. So it's certainly something that could possibly be correct. It's just that when you look at the evidence, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The lengths that mythicists have to go to in order to make some of the evidence conform to their idea are absolutely absurd. Yet some people, such as our friend Richard Carrier, who we talked about before, are literally stake their entire career on it. So, for example, there's a reference in Paul's letter to the Romans where he talks about Jesus and says that he was of the seed of Abraham, seed of David. And what that means, if you look at it in context, and if you look at all the references to the use of that word, spermatos, is that he was a descendant of King David. Now, Richard Carrier tries to argue that Paul didn't believe that Jesus was a human being and believed that Jesus was a purely celestial figure who lived in the heavens.
Or in a cosmic sperm bank.
Exactly. So he has to try and reconcile that idea with this reference by Paul to Jesus being a descendant of David. So what he does is he comes up with, by a very convoluted argument, he comes up with the idea that the celestial cosmic Jesus was created out of literal physical sperm that God took from King David and stored in a cosmic sperm bank in the sky.
That doesn't sound anything like even the most perverted.
It is one of the stupidest arguments I've ever seen in print. And yet we're meant to take this guy seriously. And whenever you talk to mythicists, they say Richard Carrier has a PhD from Columbia University, to which I say, well, that's great. Maybe Columbia University should ask for it back.
So do people on Ken Ham's team have PhDs? Like, do you take them seriously?
Yeah, and the example I always use, there's a guy called Dr. Jerry Bou, B-O-U-W, in California. He has a PhD in astrophysics. And he is also a geocentrist. He believes that the Earth is at the center of the universe. Not surprisingly, he has a kind of a bit of a bias because he's also a fundamentalist Christian and a biblical literalist, and that's the real reason he's a geocentrist. But, he's got a PhD in astrophysics. He's also got something that Richard Carrier's never had, and that's an academic career. Teaches at a university. I don't know how the university manages to reconcile that with the fact that the guy's a geocentrist. But you can find someone with a PhD who believes in virtually anything. That having a PhD doesn't make you right; it just makes you well qualified.
Right. On a side note, what's your opinion on Bart Ehrman's blog? Like, he gets a lot of flack from the nutty Christ mythers on Bart Ehrman's book being a clusterfuck, even though it's just meant to relay to a popular audience.
Yeah. Ehrman, I think Ehrman misunderstood the mythicists when he wrote that book. I think he wrote that book, Did Jesus Exist? Because he kept coming across mythicists at conferences and so on, and some of his lectures, mythicists would come up to him and sort of say, "Why do you believe in a historical Jesus?" So he thought, well, I'll explain why. I don't think he quite realised exactly how nutty mythicists are. And Carrier's reaction to Bart Ehrman was kind of crazed, and to say the least. And Ehrman just sort of looked at Carrier, responded to him a couple of times, and then basically said, "Okay, you're a bit of a nutcase," and have left him to one side, which Carrier doesn't like. Carrier is something of a narcissist, and one thing narcissists don't like is being ignored. So he's been ranting at Ehrman ever since, and it's kind of amusing to watch.
It's when Bart
I don't think Carrier realizes quite how ridiculous he looks. I don't think he understands that.
Like Bart Ehrman says that if you got nutcases on both sides screeching at you, you're doing something right.
Yeah, and I can relate to that because I've got Christians on one side telling me that I'm a terrible, terrible person because I don't believe in their God and don't believe that Jesus was the God. And then I've got mythicists on the other side telling me that I'm a Christian apologist because I don't subscribe to their fringe theory. I think I'm kind of getting it somewhat right because I'm getting copying the loons on both sides.
Well, that, and obviously because you're a paid, you're hired from the Vatican.
Yeah, a paid Vatican operative, according to one guy who was warning others on an atheist forum about me and saying, "Yeah, that guy's a paid Vatican operative." So I keep referring to that, and I'm still waiting for the paycheck. It hasn't arrived. So I like the Vatican short of money. I don't know what their problem is.
Like, aside from mythicism, the topics I notice you tackling the most are the Dark Ages, Galileo caricature in them. But what's your take on the Enlightenment narrative? That after the Renaissance, people ushered in this golden age of reason and discarded religion, and religion had to borrow its values from these wonderful thinkers.
Yeah, to a certain extent, there certainly was a major change in Western intellectual history in the 18th century. And some of that was due to people like Voltaire and Hume and the other so-called Enlightenment thinkers. But to say that all modern secular Western values come from those thinkers is incorrect. And actually, a lot of stuff that we value, science, for example, and a lot of ideas that we prize, such as the idea of egalitarianism and the idea that slavery is a bad idea, actually have some religious origins. So when I say science has some religious origins, I don't subscribe to the idea that science arose out of Christian thought, but certainly the idea that the universe was a rational creation by a rational God, and therefore not only could be but should be apprehended rationally by humans, actually was a medieval Christian idea. And that is one of the foundations of what eventually turned into the scientific method. It's too simplistic, though, to say, as some Christian apologists do, that science has its origins in Christianity. But it's also too simplistic to say that, or actually it's erroneous to say that there was no contribution from Christian thought to the rise of science. In fact, I've just started reading probably the definitive book on the subject, which is Amos Funkenstein's Theology and the Scientific Imagination. Just came out in a second edition from Princeton. Not exactly light reading, but it really does detail the very clear link between theological thought particularly in the Middle Ages, in laying some of the foundations of what later became science. The same thing goes with emancipation and the abolition of slavery. That was originally a religious movement, and a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers that say people like Pinker holds up in his recent book on the Enlightenment, were using their wonderful, enormous brains and reason to justify slavery and racism, not to argue against it. Now, others did argue against it, but to say that our ideas about the equality of humanity all comes from Enlightenment thinking is simply not true. Some of it comes from some quite radical Christian ideas.
Of course, they don't tell you about the scientific racism because that goes against their narrative.
Yeah, that's right. And some of those Enlightenment thinkers were quite happy to justify some pretty horrific ideas, to our mind. But yeah, they kind of get sort of filtered out of the neat little narrative. And this is the problem I find with a lot of new atheist history. Is a lot of it is actually a kind of a fairy tale where they are shaping the historical, cherry picking bits of history and putting it together into this sort of narrative, and it's usually a kind of a moralistic narrative as well.
Gone with the Wind seems more historically accurate than new atheist history.
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, it's not Pocahontas level, like Disney Pocahontas.
Yeah, I mean, for example, going back to Galileo, I quite often refer to the standard narrative about Galileo that you find in New Atheist discourse as the cartoon version, because it bears about the same relationship to reality as a cartoon. It's got like cartoon villains, the Catholic Church and the Inquisition are all stupid and ignorant, but actually they weren't. They were neither stupid nor ignorant. And Galileo is this wonderful icon and a beacon of reason, where actually he was a bit of a troll. He was very good at annoying people. He's kind of a funny guy, but he was very good at baiting people, and as a result, he made a lot of enemies. The real story of what happened with Galileo is actually much more interesting than the cartoon version. But I think the key thing that most people, and certainly most atheists, don't realise is that Galileo did not prove that the Earth goes around the sun. He made some arguments, some of which turned out to be true, some of which turned out to be absolute crap. But the problem was that in 1616 and 1632, when he had the two trials in front of the Inquisition, the scientific jury was still very much out on heliocentrism, and the Inquisition knew that. There were actually 7 competing cosmological models, some of which were heliocentric, some of which were geocentric, and some of which were geoheliocentric. So with the sun, the Earth at the centre, the sun going around the Earth, and the other planets going around the sun. So it's the Tychonian system. And around Galileo's time, the evidence was heavily towards something closer to the Tychonian system than it was to the Copernican system that Galileo was championing. And probably the other thing to keep in mind is that, as a result, is that very few scientists at that time actually accepted Copernicanism. In fact, a survey of scholars done up to about 1616 by a historian called Jim Westman shows that there were only 11 scholars in the whole of Europe that actually accepted the Copernican system. So it wasn't as though there was some huge scientific consensus that the church was going against. The church had the scientific consensus on its side, and made sure that it had checked that. They actually put it out to the assayers and said, "What's the scientific word on this guy's theory?" And the assayers came back and said, "Everyone thinks he's wrong. Pretty much everyone thinks he's wrong." So when they sentenced him, the edict that they handed down said this idea that the Earth goes around the sun is absurd in philosophy, semicolon, and formally heretical. So it's not heretical at full stop. It's, first of all, it's absurd in philosophy. Absurd in philosophy means scientifically wrong. They're talking about natural philosophy, science. And what they're saying is, we've checked. We've gone to the scientists. They're telling us you're wrong. And as a result of that, we're going to stick with the more literal interpretation of the Bible. Therefore, what you're saying is also formally heretical. And this is it's a bit of a nuanced, I suppose, look at the story, but it's actually what happened. They checked the science. They found the science was on their side. It was probably about another 60 years before the consensus really changed. And that, it's easy for us to be wise in hindsight and say, well, the church was wrong. But in 1616, the church had the science firmly on their side.
And like, if you were
It's a
to,
very important thing.
if we're to take the Galileo caricature at face value, then it doesn't really make sense that the church gave him such a hard time, and Kepler and Newton never got that level of
Yeah.
persecution.
Yeah, well, I mean, Newton had the advantage of living in a Protestant country, and therefore, but yeah, the Protestants were quite happy to come down heavy on ideas they didn't like. So, but Kepler probably didn't get into trouble mainly because there was kind of a confluence of political and personal issues that came together that really sort of ensnared Galileo. Up until about 1616, no one cared that Galileo was a heliocentrist. A couple of years before he was put on trial, he wrote a book on sunspots where he made it absolutely clear that he was a Copernican. And that book, like all books in Italy at the time, had to go through the church censorship process before it could be published. And the censors read it and didn't bat an eyelid. They didn't care. So it wasn't like they actually had some major problem with heliocentrism. So what changed between when he wrote that book on the sunspots and a couple of years later when he got hauled up before the Inquisition? What changed was Galileo started to interpret the Bible. And so he got into a conversation at the court of the Duke of Tuscany, where he was being challenged on his Copernicanism, and he began to argue, well, Copernicanism can be compatible with the Bible if you read the Bible this way. He then wrote a letter which got widely publicised to the Grand Duchess of Tuscany, Christina, where he laid out his ideas in more detail. That's what the church got upset about, because in the wake of the Reformation, a mere mathematicus, which is what he was, sort of at the lowest level of the academic hierarchy, interpreting the Bible was very much a no-no. And that's when they started to investigate him. And if you look at the correspondence between Galileo and his friends around about the time of the first trial in 1616, they are telling him, they kept asking me about whether I'd ever heard you interpreting the Bible. That was what they got upset about. And so he kind of walked into a theological minefield, and then wasn't really able to kind of get himself out of it. Plus, he was rude to the Pope, which was usually a bad idea in the early 17th century.
Well,
Yeah.
So the Pope was effectively his boss. You know, like, especially since the Pope was sort of like his boss at the time.
Sorry, yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, the Pope kind of invited him to write a book. This is after the first trial. The Pope said, "Look, you can write a book on which of these theories makes the most sense." Galileo then wrote a book, which was a dialogue concerning the dialogue of the two world systems, where he was clearly making a very, very strong case for the Copernican system over the Ptolemaic system. And he put some arguments used by the Pope in favour of the Ptolemaic system in the mouth of a character called Simplicissimus, which can be interpreted to mean the fool or the idiot. And the Pope, not surprisingly, wasn't very happy. So what does this mean that the church hated science? No. Does it mean that the church couldn't tolerate any kind of thought of heliocentrism? Also no. What it means is that if you start stumbling around into some fairly weighty theological issues in the context of the Counter-Reformation and the wars of religion, and you're rude to the Pope, you're probably going to find yourself in the early 17th century, you're going to find yourself in some hot water. And that's what happened.
Yeah. Like, I've noticed lately you've been going after atheists who insist that state atheism in communist countries like Soviet Russia, China, North Korea, and all of them is not really atheism. And to be clear, this is not reflective on atheists in general for the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the argument is that that religion has done horrible things and killed lots of people in the name of religion, but no one has ever done that in the name of atheism. And that's simply not true. And the argument is, well, Stalin did kill lots and lots of people, but he didn't do it because he was an atheist. He did it because he was a bad man. And to a certain extent, that is true. But some of the people that he killed and Lenin killed, in the period from about 1922 through to about 1941 were killed specifically because they opposed the state-sanctioned atheist ideology of Marxist-Leninism. One of the tenets of Marxist-Leninism was that atheism was right, and what they started to do from about 1922 onwards was shut down churches, blow churches up, demolish churches, turn churches into museums, and imprison a great many clergy. And anyone who objected to that also tended to get arrested, persecuted, imprisoned, tortured, sent to gulags, and shot. So thousands of people, literally thousands of people, were killed specifically because Marxist-Leninism was an atheistic ideology. Not simply because they were opponents to the government, but because they were opponents to atheism. And there's actually, again, another excellent book that's just come out by a lady called Victoria Smolkin, which is called A Sacred Space is Never Empty, A History of Soviet Atheism, which details all this in quite a bit of scholarly detail. So the claim that atheism has got no blood on its hands is simply historically inaccurate. Not everyone who was killed in the Soviet Union by the government were killed because of that state-sanctioned atheism, but thousands of them were. And to pretend that that didn't happen is simply nonsense.
Oh, but atheism is just like a belief. It has no dogma or anything that can be used.
And that's the argument. That's the argument they give me. They say, well, atheism is simply being without a belief in God. So there's no ideology attached. You can use that same argument to say, well, Christianity hasn't got any blood on its hands because Christianity, there's nothing in the central tenets of Christianity that require people to be killed. That's something that people have come along and interpreted or twisted Christianity to do. We say the same thing about atheism. And it doesn't absolve Christians who have burnt people at the stake and massacred people in the name of their faith, nor can it absolve Marxist-Leninists who have killed literally thousands of people in the name of atheism. So it's a little bit of rhetorical trickery, and basically, I think these people, atheists, need to face up to the fact that atheism can be, like any other ideology, can be taken and twisted in that particular way. Nathan Johnson, who I mentioned before, in his book on new atheist historiography, makes exactly that point. And that's I think you might have seen a Twitter exchange with a couple of people who were objecting to that when I reviewed Johnson's book. And there will be an upcoming article in my series of what I call the Great Myth series on my blog on the myth of Soviet atheistic innocence, because that is simply nonsense. But it's nonsense that's been peddled by some fairly prominent people, including Christopher Hitchens. Hitchens tries to argue that atheism is absolved of the crimes of the Soviet Union because the Soviet ideology was effectively a religion. So it's actually religion's fault. Now, that's another little bit of rhetorical trickery. I mean, was it a religion? It was a very strange sort of religion.
Charm and rhetoric was its shtick.
Yeah, that's right. And when people say, well, they had a cult of personality, and they had ceremonies, and they had slogans and all this stuff. That's all stuff that you find in religions. That's all stuff you find in lots of things.
Even the new atheist leaders have cults of personality.
They are, yeah. I don't think they've quite got to the point where they've got liturgies or chants. But if Soviet Stalinism was a religion, then so is the Olympic movement. I mean, the Olympic movement has songs and ceremonies and symbols and rituals and all of those things as well. So does that make it a religion? I find that argument pretty silly, to be honest.
Yeah, and the militant atheists is what the Bolsheviks literally call themselves. There was
an organisation sponsored by the government called the League of the Militant Godless. It had something like 90,000 members. It had branches all over the Soviet Union. It published its own newspaper. It published a monthly magazine. All that had circulation in millions. They were pretty atheist. They were quite adamant about it.
In terms of intolerance, bigotry, propaganda, and vilification of religion. Like, do you see much parallels between them and the new atheist slash anti-theist today? Like, without the violence in the West, anyway.
There's an interesting chapter at the end of that book by Nathan Johnston on they called the New Atheism Myth and History, where he does talk about how some of the language used by people like Victor Stenger, Sam Harris, Peter Boghossian,
Christopher Hitchens, Peter Boghossian, Aaron Ra.
they're all sort of saying stuff that does sound quite similar to some of the slogans of the Soviets. Now that doesn't mean that those guys are on the brink of sending people to gulags or having religious people shot.
Right.
But when your tolerance of religion is actually sounding quite intolerant, then Johnson makes the argument there's a lesson from history about what happens when that sort of thing happens, and we need to, if we're going to be responsible atheists, we need to guard against that kind of language. So yeah, I think there are some parallels, absolutely.
Let me see.
What?
Oh, let me see. I think I got my own questions. Try and get it up. All right. Let's see. Oh wait, that's yours. Oh yeah. Is going after fellow atheists instead of, say, creationists harder for you because you are, an atheist yourself?
I don't know if it's harder. I used to debate creationists until I realised that it was pointless. When I was young and idealistic and not old and cynical the way I am now, I used to think that what you had to do is confront creationists with the evidence, and they would get it. And the problem was that they just didn't understand evolution. Now, they certainly didn't understand evolution. There's no doubt about that. What I didn't realise, though, in my youth and naivety, was that they weren't believing in creationism because of any kind of understanding of science. They were believing in creationism because it came with a package, and the package was the simplistic truths of fundamentalist Christianity. And if they rejected creationism, then they would have to reject the rest of the package. And they liked the package because the package made them feel good. So it was pointless trying to argue with them about creationism because effectively they weren't in it for rational reasons. They were for emotional reasons. I suppose the reason I do bother with debunking new atheist bad history, there's a number of reasons. First of all, I have a very Irish, comes from my ancestry, but a very Irish hatred of hypocrisy. And when I come across new atheists saying you should pay attention to the experts, you should look at the evidence, you should do your homework, you should do your research, you should look at things rationally, and then turn around and they don't do any of those things when it comes to history, I find that hypocritical. So these people who preach about checking your facts and paying attention to expertise and so on, who then reject all that when it's convenient, I find that's kind of irritating. But the other thing I have noticed is thankfully there are a reasonable number of atheists who actually do practice what they preach. And so when you sometimes when I do confront people with this stuff, they say, "Okay, thanks. Didn't realise that. You've changed my view." And that, I suppose, that kind of keeps me going. It doesn't happen often enough, but it does happen. And every now and then I get an email from someone saying, "Look, I used to debate you about mythicism on some forum ages ago, and I called you lots of names and so on, but I've gone away and thought about it, and now I think you're probably right. So thanks for sticking with it." So I've received about 4 of those, so that makes it worthwhile. So it's not hard for me to do it. It's kind of fun, actually.
That's good. Oh yeah, you've and other podcasts have mentioned how you've been studying the history of Christianity for a while. What exactly got you into that?
Well, I mentioned that I was raised in a Christian family, and was a fairly sort of unfanatical sort of believer in my teens. I happened to sit on the sidelines one day when I was about 16 of a discussion at my school between the school's sort of biggest evangelical Christian and a guy who was also the school principal's son, but he was an atheist. And I was kind of more inclined towards her point of view, even though I found her rather annoying. But I was listening to the arguments that this guy was coming up with, and he was making a lot more sense. So she kept saying, Jesus said this and Jesus did that. And he kept saying, how do you know? And she'd say, it's in the Gospels. And he'd say, when were the Gospels written? Who were they written by? And as a young guy who was already very interested in history, I thought he was asking some good questions and making some good points. And she didn't have any answers. She wasn't very, hadn't even thought about this stuff. And I had to admit to myself that at that stage, I hadn't thought about that stuff either. I just sort of accepted the Gospels were written by who they were claimed to be written by. So I went to do some research so that if I'd ever found myself in that sort of conversation, I would be able to do a better job than she would, and I'd be able to defend what I believed. And that kind of led me down a path where eventually I realised that I didn't believe it anymore. I believed that I came to understand the origins of Christianity as Jesus as a apocalyptic preacher of a kind that was fairly common in the early first century Jewish sphere, and I suppose I've kind of gone from there. So that's sort of what got me interested in it, and I've sort of stayed interested in it because it's a fascinating topic. It's one of those subjects in ancient history that I particularly like, where there's a reasonable amount of source material and it can be interpreted lots of different ways. And those sorts of historical puzzles are the ones that I enjoy the most.
Right, and you've been on this topic of Jesus mythicism since the 80s?
Mythicists have really only kind of come back into their own quite recently. I never came across any mythicists.
Yeah, like, I mean, Jesus history in general.
Yeah, certainly. Since about like 1984, I've been studying. So 30 something years. But it was interesting that I remember never seeing any kind of mythicism on the internet for the first sort of like 10 years or so that I was on the net, which is I've been on the net since.
Right, they've been started crawling around since the 2000s.
That's right. I started to see some sort of glimmers of it on some sort of conspiracy sites in about the 1990s, late 1990s. But it really took off from about as you say, about the early 2000s, and like a lot of silly ideas, like flat earthism and so on, it's kind of grown as an internet phenomenon. Now that may tell you something about it.
It had to grow around the time flat earthers were going.
Yeah, I don't know how much overlap there is between the mythicist community and the flat Earth community. There might be some. I don't know.
Yeah, or young Earth creationists is a more substantive parallel.
Yeah, one thing I have noticed though is that a lot of the people who are very committed to Jesus mythicism tend to be the kind of people who get a lot of self-esteem from the idea that they know better than everyone. Carrier is an example of that. David Fitzgerald is another one. There's a guy called Raphael Villatasta who's another one.
Oh, that delusional weirdo.
They seem to get a lot of their self-esteem from the idea that they're smarter than everyone else because they've worked this out and everyone else is deluded and wrong. Again, there definitely is an overlap between narcissism and some of these fringe ideas.
And most of them, like Latester and Grandpa Godfrey in general, were until recently were conservative Christians. Yeah.
Latester was a conservative Christian who even then believed in fringe theories. Back then, and this is only a couple of years ago, he genuinely believed that the Gospel of Matthew was not only written by Matthew, the disciple, but was originally written in Aramaic, and was arguing quite strenuously along those lines. He has tried to erase all trace of his previous beliefs from the internet. He gets quite embarrassed when anyone brings them up, but he's kind of gone from one wacky extreme to the other, and who knows
while your beliefs change, the culture remains.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh yeah, funniest false history tale you've ever heard of?
Oh, every now and then I think I've come across all of the completely silly and crazy theories, and then a new one pops up. I'm trying to think of the funniest. Yeah, it is a little bit hard to pick just one. Yeah, it's interesting that there's a particular type of person who's usually not extremely well educated, and what they do is they tend to come up with an idea that is simply possible, and then they go looking for the evidence to try and prove it. And by cherry picking the evidence, they think that they're actually verifying their theory. This is something that when you study history formally as an academic discipline, you get warned against. The idea is not to simply find the evidence that seems to support your idea. You need to try and critically assess your idea to see if it actually makes sense, and that's what these people tend not to do. So the historical Jesus studies, for example, is full of fringe crackpot theories where Jesus was really the Judas the Galilean, or Jesus was really Herod Philip, or Jesus was really Julius Caesar. There's a whole heap of them, and these guys write great big thick books that are full of footnotes, and they've gone and read all the sources, and they're convinced that they're right, and they just can't see why no one else finds them terribly convincing. I've got a small bookshelf collection of those, which I collect for my amusement. So
our mutual friend, Biblical History Skeptics, has an entire shelf of Mythicist books.
Yeah.
Writing his thesis on that.
Yeah, he's got a great collection, actually. I refuse to give them shelf space. I keep them in a box in my cupboard. I don't want.
Good call.
It's like a porn stash, really. I don't want them actually out on my shelves because people might look at them and think that I actually subscribe to that crap. So it stays in a box with the word shame written on it.
Oh, that's funny. See.
No, but I think it's again, when I was a younger guy, when I was like about 18, I read a book called Holy Blood and Holy Grail. It's the book that the Da Vinci Code effectively ripped off. The difference being that the Da Vinci Code was written as fiction, and the Holy Blood and Holy Grail was presented as fact. But it was written back in about 1982 by these four crackpots in England, and they thought they'd uncovered this centuries-old conspiracy to protect the bloodline of Jesus Christ, and that there was a secret society called the Priory of Sion that maintained this secret. Now, the whole thing was complete garbage. But what they'd done was they found a way to link a whole lot of old conspiracy theories, and every time they went looking for something that might link them, they found it. But what they didn't do was actually sort of subject it to any kind of critical analysis. Otherwise, they would have realised that what they were doing was basically creating their own paper trail. But I read that book when I was 18 and was very impressed by it. I came back and read it again when I was about 22, after having done a university degree, including a degree in history. And it was like I was reading a different book. Now, what had happened, I'd only, maybe I've matured a bit, but really what had happened is I'd been trained in how to do critical analysis. And so at the age of 18, I didn't recognize Holy Blood and Holy Grail as a pile of horse shit. Whereas by 22, I'd actually developed the skills to be able to recognize that. And it's also, that's probably where I got my love of pseudo-historical theories. I find them fascinating, and find the people who, trying to understand the people who believe them I suppose is one of my weird hobbies.
The Protestants will keep you busy with that.
Yeah. There's no shortage of crackpot theories on the religious side of things for sure.
Well, yeah, like I can't remember like a lot of the pagan like parallels or whatever, like the pagan. Oh wait, no, it's with the pagan holidays. A lot of them come from Protestant history going against the Catholic Church.
Yeah, that's right, and again, that's another sort of bit of pseudo history. This idea that anything in folklore has a pagan origin. Just this morning, someone on Twitter was asking me about a book about paganism in early medieval Europe, and there was a picture on the cover of this book was a picture of the Green Man. Now, the Green Man is a iconographical motif that you find in a lot of medieval churches. It's a man's face made of leaves with leaves coming out of his mouth. And for a very long time, folklorists believed that the Green Man was some kind of pagan symbol, and that it had survived from pre-Christian times and was being hidden by crypto pagans in the carvings that they were doing in these Christian churches. More recent analysis shows actually that that's not true. There's no examples of the Green Man prior to about like the 12th or 13th century, and it seems to have actually been adopted by Franciscans initially from manuscript illuminations, which were in turn based on some Islamic decorative art. So it's not a pagan symbol at all. It's a Muslim symbol that's been adopted by Christians. Which is nowhere near as fun. Pagans are much more fun. So this is why people like finding pagan origins to stuff. And this is why when you tell people that, Easter bunnies and Easter eggs are not pagan in origin, they get very upset. For some reason, they want them to be pagan. It's somehow less fun if they have a Christian origin.
Oh, and speaking of pagans, there's neo-pagans that anti-theists have sort of allied themselves with because they both hate Christians, and as some pagans will say that our history with Christianity is like one big wrecking ball. What would you say about that?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of neo-pagan history is about as bad as new atheist history. That's a generalization, though. There are certainly some neo-pagans that I've come across who are very good researchers and are very good at debunking a lot of the stuff that some of their co-religionists believe. But things like the history of the witch craze, for example, is often taught in neo-pagan circles as being this massive Holocaust where there were like 9 million women were burnt at the stake and so on. Now, I don't think anyone being burnt at the stake is a good idea. One person being burnt at the stake is pretty awful, let alone thousands. And there certainly were thousands of people who were hanged and burnt at the stake. 80% of them, roughly, were women. And we estimate that there would be somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 such executions between the 15th century and the 18th century. That's a hell of a lot of people being killed for an imaginary crime. These people were supposedly witches. Yeah. But it wasn't 9 million. It wasn't 2 million. It wasn't a million. It was 40,000. That doesn't make it okay, right. But there's no reason to exaggerate the horror. The other thing that the neo-pagans claim is that those women were actually pagans and that there is a direct link between modern neo-paganism back to the beliefs of these people in the period of the witch craze. There was a massive pagan survival from pre-Christian times. The evidence for that is extremely flimsy, and it's almost certainly not true. And a lot of the stuff that neo-pagans claim have ancient origins don't. Neo-paganism really dates back to only about as far back as the 1950s. A lot of neo-pagans don't like being told that, but their religion is actually largely made up. I mean, don't get me wrong, I've got no issue with neo-pagans.
Right.
Most of the ones I know are lovely people, but sometimes they say stuff about history that's crap.
And then they say, like, their caricature of the Christianization of Europe and Scandinavia was one big genocide, and you had your Charlemagnes and your Olafs here, and then you had peaceful conversions elsewhere.
Yeah, and the on the whole, the conversions by the sword were the exception, not the rule. Probably the best book on that topic is by a guy called Richard Fletcher. He wrote pretty much the definitive historical monograph on the conversion of Western Europe called The Conversion of Europe. And that's an excellent book. And it makes it very clear that it was actually largely pretty peaceful. On the whole, what tended to happen was that a leader would convert, usually for more for sort of social and political and economic reasons than anything else. And then everyone else in the kingdom would then sort of follow suit, because religion in the pre-modern world was very much a communal thing. It was very much a matter of what your community did. It wasn't so much a matter of individual conscience. That's a much more modern conception of religion. So the idea that it was one great big sort of forced genocide, again, that's a little bit of a Protestant historical trope, because there was this idea that the Reformation was freeing people from the clutches of the wicked Catholic Church, and that they were all very reluctantly sort of under the thumb of the Pope and so on, and then Protestantism came along and rescued them all. This has been revised quite a bit by historians of the Reformation, and there's a book that came out in the early 90s called The Stripping of the Altars, that is a reanalysis of the Protestant Reformation in England, that basically said it wasn't that the people desperately wanted to embrace Protestantism. If anything, they kind of liked their Catholic faith and resisted the enforced Reformation that was kind of rammed down their throats by Henry VIII and his pals, and to the extent that there were actually a couple of major uprisings where they were trying to restore what they saw as their traditional religion. The period just before the Reformation was really a period of remarkable lay piety. In the Middle Ages, for most of the medieval period, people sort of believed in Christianity, but it was reasonably unenthusiastic. Not that they didn't like it; it was just they didn't. It wasn't a major part of their lives. That began to change in the 13th century, particularly with the rise of the Franciscans and Dominicans, who were basically taking religion to the people. And so what you see is an upswing in lay devotion, in non-clergy becoming quite devout. And if anything, the Reformation almost grew out of that. This enthusiasm for religion was one of the reasons why people started to embrace the idea of reading the Bible, and the Reformation really kind of fed from that.
And does this unenthusiasm for religion tie into the Crusades very much? Or how does it affect that?
It certainly was part of it. The crusading movement sometimes gets reframed as more of an economic and political phenomenon rather than a religious one. And it certainly had economic and political elements, but it's important not to lose sight of the fact that it was very much a popular religious movement. And if you read the accounts of the First Crusade, all of them really, but if you read the accounts of the First Crusade, over and over again, the leaders would start squabbling and get involved in these sort of like political disputes, and the people would come to them and say, "Listen, you guys need to sort this out, because otherwise we're going to Jerusalem without you." There was a real genuine kind of weird, popular, apocalyptic religious fervor that drove the Crusades. There's a great book called The Armies of Heaven by a fellow called Richard Rubinstein, which is on about exactly how much of the crusading movement was a popular apocalyptic idea. They had some very strange ideas about what they were going to see when they got to Jerusalem, and it was very much tied up with the idea that the world was going to end soon. And so they needed to get to Jerusalem. They needed to restore the kingdom of Jesus Christ at that place, which was in their mind was the center of the world before the apocalypse came. And that actually explains some of the behavior of the Crusaders. For example, massacring Jews on the way to the Crusades, which they did with great relish in Germany. It didn't make a whole lot of sense that they would be killing Jews, but it was part of this apocalyptic thinking. The Jews were the Christ killers, and so we need to kill them while we're on our way to go and cleanse the holy places.
And it was like 1,000 years after Jesus was crucified.
Yeah, that's right. So there was certainly a very strong popular religious element to it. When Urban II preached the First Crusade, he was expecting maybe a few thousand knights. What he got was a mass movement. So, and he didn't expect that. That wasn't what he was looking for. He was quite happy about it. But there was a whole lot of elements that kind of came together, and that him coming up with this idea of we're going to go and have a holy war to free Jerusalem was really sort of a spark that kind of blew the whole thing up.
And would that be similar to Torquemada and the Inquisition?
Yeah, and a lot of that stuff, some of the nastier stuff that happened in that period, did come out of popular religious movements. There's a book by Norman Cohen called The Pursuit of the Millennium, which is about how these apocalyptic movements would arise over and over and over again throughout Western history, and he concentrates on a number of these apocalyptic movements that arose in the medieval period, but he then links it to some much more modern ones as well, including Marxism, which he sort of regards as almost like a secular offshoot of this apocalyptic tendency.
Right. Marxism was supposed to be proposed as communist society was supposed to be interpreted as the end of history.
Yeah, exactly right. So that he sees Marxism very much as being part of that tradition, right down to violent revolution being the way that you usher in the new millennium and the Holy Kingdom. The difference, of course, with Marxism being that it wasn't a religious movement. So, but we see these millenarian movements, as they're called, arising over and over and over again, and they kind of pop up about once a century throughout the medieval period as well.
Right.
So, yeah. Since we were also getting into the killing of Jews, I figured like I'll have the last question that I have up for myself. Basically, it's like we went into this before where I'm trying to think of how to word this. Oh yeah, Hitler. Hitler's religiosity has been sort of debated on all sides of the theological spectrum.
Yeah.
Where you have Christians saying he was an atheist, and atheists saying he was a devout Catholic.
Yeah.
You've had podcasts and you've gone into that a bit, but where do you sort of stand on that? Like, how strong was Hitler's religiosity, and how much did that play into his politics?
Yeah. Okay. So I think I touched on it before when I said Hitler was definitely not an atheist, but he certainly wasn't a believer. The idea that he was a devout Catholic is absolute nonsense. He was raised a Catholic, and his mother was extremely devout, but he was not devout even as a teenager. He was confirmed as a Catholic, so he went through his confirmation ceremony at the age of, I think it was about 17. Or 16, and was extremely reluctant, was basically forced into it by his mother. And people who knew him at the time said that he just regarded the whole thing as nonsense. He left home at the age of 17, and he stopped going to church at that time. Now, what people who like to try and say that he was a Christian do is they quote speeches that he gave and stuff from his book, Mein Kampf, where he talks about being a Christian. But if you actually look at the dates of those pronouncements, it was in the period from around 1922 to 1933, where he was trying to win power legitimately through the democratic process. So he was sent to prison in 1922 after a failed military coup. And from that point on, he said to the rest of the Nazi party, we are going to have to, that didn't work. We're going to have to try and win power legitimately. And so what he had to do was he couldn't really stand up and say, I think Christianity is nonsense. That's what he said privately. Privately, he said, Christianity is this moribund, decaying, dying, ultimately Jewish philosophy that was going to die out once National Socialism was fully in control. But publicly, he was dealing with a country that was 85% Christian, and also he was struggling to win the Catholic vote. The Catholics were dominated German politics in the south and, to a certain extent, the west of Germany, and the Catholic vote was very much with the Centre Party, Zentrum, the Centre, sometimes called the Centre Catholic Party, who held the balance of power in the Reichstag during most of the Weimar Republic. Hitler really needed those votes, and if you have a look at the voting patterns in the last few elections leading up to his seizure of power in 1933, if you look at the where he got the most votes, it was largely in the northern eastern Protestant areas, and he got the lowest votes in the southern and western areas around Bavaria. So he was desperately trying to get the Catholic vote, and one of the ways he tried to do that was by proclaiming things like, I know in my heart that Jesus Christ was a fighter, and he tried to paint Jesus as some kind of anti-Semite who hated Jews, which is kind of crazy. Privately, he actually did not like Christianity at all. He wasn't as fanatically anti-Christian as some of his henchmen. So Martin Bormann was vehemently anti-Christian. So was Joseph Goebbels was as well, and Rudolf Hess to a certain extent. But Albert Speer, who was one of his henchmen and his favourite architect, in his book on his time in the Third Reich upper echelon, talked about how Martin Bormann used to rile Hitler up by telling him about some bishop who preached a sermon against the Nazis, or showing him some piece of anti-Nazi propaganda from a Catholic or from some other Christian, and Hitler used to get very, very angry, but then would say, we've got to wait until we finish the war. Once we finish the war, then we can turn our attention to the destruction of Christianity. But there's no doubt that the guy was not a fan of Christianity. For some pretty obvious reasons, and mainly because there was a hell of a lot of opposition to the Nazis by Catholics. There was a strong element of devout Catholics in the Nazi resistance movement. Klaus von Stauffenberg, the guy who almost killed Hitler by planting a bomb in his bunker, was a devout Catholic and was actually motivated by his Catholic faith. And this is all connected to the myth of Hitler's Pope, the idea that Pope Pius XII was actually pro-Nazi. Again, our friend Christopher Hitchens is a major proponent of this idea. Now, there's a lot of debate about Pius XII and his reaction to the Third Reich, and particularly to the Holocaust. And could he have done more? Should he have done more? I'm very much of the opinion that he could have and probably should have. But he took a very sort of neutral political stance, openly, but in secret, he was working against the Nazis. And there's a book that came out a couple of years ago called Church of Spies, the papacy's secret war against the Nazis, by a guy called Riebling. And he details the connections between the Vatican and the German resistance. And effectively, the Vatican was helping the resistance as much as they possibly could, including giving permission and theological blessing, literally, to the idea of killing Hitler. The Pope, through one of his underlings, actually said to a group of German officers who are plotting to kill Hitler, go right ahead. He meets the theological definition of a tyrant, and it is okay to kill him, And it's even okay to perhaps accidentally kill other people in the process of killing him. One point, one of his underlings said to the Pope, "What sort of Germany do you want?" And he said, "Well, one without Hitler. Anything without Hitler will do." So the idea that he was pro-Nazi is absolute nonsense. Whether he could have done more to speak out against them, that's certainly up for debate. But the idea that he was pro-Nazi is again, is just historical nonsense.
Yeah, I remember also, like, wasn't it also brought up to his attention when they were bringing up the Soviets with him, where he said, "Well, hey, we need to get the Soviets involved. Maybe they'll take care, like, oh yeah, well, no way, I remember. Let me go back. They were saying like, maybe we got the Nazis, and maybe they can take care of the Soviets for us."
Yeah.
And the Pope said, "Oh no, the Nazis are infinitely worse."
Yeah, he's certainly reported as saying that, and I think it's probably it's likely that he did say it. That's kind of an anecdote, though, that someone close to the Pope said after the war. I think it was actually after Pius XII died. But yeah, he certainly wasn't a fan of the Nazis. He was in Germany when the Nazis were coming into power. So he was one of the earliest people to recognise that the Nazi ideology was evil, and as early as the 1920s, when the Nazi Party was still extremely small, he spoke out quite strongly against them. When he was criticised for maybe not for being a little bit too diplomatic in his language in some of his condemnations of the Nazis, he said, "Well, I can't just single them out. If you want me to condemn them more explicitly, I'd have to do the same with the Soviet Union." And the Allies didn't really want that because the Soviet Union was on their side. So he was actually treading a fairly sort of fine diplomatic line. Whether he was erred on the side of too much diplomacy, I suppose, is the question. But what isn't in question is whether he hated Nazis. He did, and he absolutely hated Adolf Hitler and was quite happy to see the guy die.
That's good. I always found the topic of Nazi history pretty fascinating because it often does get bold, like, bring the paganism of it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think there's another sort of bit of pseudo-history that the Nazis were all pagans. Himmler certainly was. Himmler was a very strange man, but he loved all that stuff. He had this sort of like this neo-pagan Germanicist pseudo-religion as part of the SS. But Hitler thought that was all nonsense. And Hitler was quite scornful about it and said, these people who dress up in bearskins and wave around tin swords, that's just silly, and things die out for a reason, and paganism died out because it was a moribund idea. So Hitler wasn't into that stuff at all. Himmler certainly was. A couple of the other guys, Boll von Sirach, who was the head of the Hitler Youth, certainly was as well. But the idea that Hitler was heavily pagan, or also the idea that Hitler was heavily into the occult, is also something that you get spoken of. There's not a lot of evidence for that either. Himmler certainly wasn't.
You got anything you want to say, Engine? Or you think, we got a lot?
Yeah, we should be wrapping up soon. Any closing thoughts and where people can find you other than your blog?
I'm on Twitter as well. My Twitter handle is Tim O'Neill 007 because it wasn't taken. So yeah, thanks. I'm a bit of a Bond fan. But other than that, historyforatheists.com is where you'll find me. And in the next, I'd say, the next couple of weeks, you'll see that new article where I have a bit of fun with our friend Aaron Ra, which I should probably get back to writing. So thanks for having me on, guys. Good to talk to you.
Welcome. Share, like, and subscribe if you feel like it. And see you next time.
and a butterfly